Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today is a very exciting day here at Verified First because we are joined by Seyfarth Shaw's labor and employment partner, Sam Schwartz-Fenwick, to discuss how HR tech improves diversity in hiring. This past year, we have spent our time having important conversations with some of America's most notable leaders in the HR and TA space. Through our HR at the Table thought leadership webinars, we've discussed the role HR and TA have in DE&I, brand, technology, talent, culture, leadership, ROI, the employee experience, and so much more. Our goal is to bring relevant and timely topics to our HR and TA community that supports you in your roles. All of these topics can be accessed through our HR at the Table resources page on our website at verifiedfirst.com. With each on-demand webinar you watch, you can earn 1 SHRM and 1 HRCI credit. You also have the option to receive credit for attending today's webinar too. If these discussions are important to you, be sure to check out our HR at the Table calendar to keep up to date on the topics we're talking about. We've also worked very hard to bring you a comprehensive deep dive of all of the topics we've discussed through this series. So if you'd like to gather more insight, be sure to check out our blog page, also at verifiedfirst.com. Now, before we dive into today's discussion, I'd like to discuss some housekeeping items. As I mentioned, this webinar is available for 1 SHRM and 1 HRCI credit. For our live attendees looking to receive credit, be sure to stick around for our post-webinar survey. If you're listening to this on demand, check your email for instructions on how to redeem your credit. Don't worry, this webinar is being recorded, so you can use it as a resource, pass it along to your coworkers, or watch it whenever you want. We would love to answer as many of your questions as we can today, so make sure you utilize those chat and question functionalities. For some practice, I'd love to hear from the audience. Use the chat or question functionality and let us know if you're a returning HR at the Table fan. If not, let us know what you're looking forward to for today's discussion. I personally am looking forward to hearing the ways in which we can leverage HR technology to attract and retain a diverse workforce. With that in mind, I'd like to kick us off by officially welcoming everyone to today's discussion. Please send a friendly hello and a warm welcome in the chat to our HR at the Table host, Liv Carter, and Seyfarth Shaw's labor and employment partner, Sam Schwartz-Fenwick. Without further ado, take it away, Liv.
Thank you, Voice in the Wind. Hi, and welcome to another episode of HR at the Table, where we're going to sit down with HR and talent acquisition professionals from some of the most notable companies and brands in the country and talk about their roles at the executive table. If you're an HR at the Table subscriber, welcome. Love to have you back. If you've attended a previous HR at the Table webinar, good to see you again. See you, right? It's great to have returning subscribers and attendees. But you're probably also wondering who I am. I am not Ben Cornett, our typical HR at the Table host. I am Liv Carter, and I will be your host for today. Our host, Ben, is with his family actually right now celebrating this amazing accomplishment of receiving his doctorate. So Ben, you're listening in, congratulations from all of us here. We hope you're enjoying that time with your family. Before we jump in and start talking about how HR tech can improve diversity in hiring, I'd like to thank today's sponsors, Smart Recruiters and Zoho Recruit. Thank you for sponsoring today's episode of HR at the Table. It's always great to have you, your guys' support. And viewers, listeners, on-demand listeners, as this is recorded, thank you for tuning in. We're glad to have you here. I am very excited to have this opportunity to sit down with and chat with Sam Schwartz-Fenwick. Like the Voice in the Wind mentioned, he is a labor and employment partner at Seyfarth Shaw, one of the top firms in the nation. And we're going to be talking about, the importance of diversity, some of the barriers that exist for organizations today, and how to effectively use technology to improve diversity in hiring, in your hiring strategy. So Sam from Chicago, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liv. So I'm so honored to be here today, and I just want to thank Verified First for the opportunity and all of the sponsors for making this possible. We want folks to feel comfortable asking questions. I think the more questions that folks ask, the better. Just keep in mind that I can't provide legal advice specific to, whatever fact scenario you're dealing with. So just try to make it more general in terms of the questions you ask. As Liv mentioned, I'm a partner who focuses on labor and employment, and my favorite part of my job is getting to help HR professionals and companies really make their workforces as diverse, equitable, and inclusive as possible. And as we know, those are always moving needles because you can never be diverse enough. So I'm really excited today to talk about some strategies that I've seen folks employ successfully.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you mentioned, diversity, equity, and inclusion being a moving needle. And I think that's exactly it, Sam. This is not a new topic, right? I almost don't even want to call it a topic, because topic you can cover in 60 minutes. Diversity, equity, inclusion is so much more than this webinar, than a podcast, than an article that you can read on. It requires heart and commitment and intentionality. So love that idea of it being a moving needle. To start off, I just love to get your opinion on why diversity matters to organizations. We seem to have the ball moving, but at the end of the day, why does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters for a lot of really strong business reasons. And beyond that, it really has a lot of corporate citizenship issues that if we want our country to be moving forward into, the more perfect union, businesses have a role to play, and investors are looking for businesses to have a role to play. You've seen that in the growing movement around ESG, where investors are wanting to say, what is your pipeline? What are you doing to make sure that there are more African American people in X profession? How are you growing it? How are you mentoring them through? Beyond that, from just a pure dollars and cents perspective, the more diverse a workplace is, the more successful that workplace will be. And there's a few reasons for that. One reason is when you make diversity a priority, you're telling people, bring your whole selves to work. The more of yourself includes the creative parts of your brain. The energy you're spending conforming can instead be used for problem solving and thinking outside the box. So there's a real performative aspect where, inclusion allows people to perform better, which yields better results. In addition, all of our customer bases are increasingly diverse. And in order to be able to serve those in as best a way as possible, you don't want a group of old, straight white men being the only ones at the table, because guess what? They're a small minority of the population. You want at the table a representative group that can think outside the box and view things in a different way.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that you mentioned the corporate responsibility. I think that as people, as members of society, we understand the importance and the value of diversity and inclusion, right? But when you're talking about bringing that into a workplace, a business, a company, where you have multiple leaders and one mission, it can get a little bit trickier. So that said, over the last few years, especially, we've seen a lot of movements, and we've seen a lot of progression inside the workplace and outside. But I'm curious on your opinion, where do you think organizations sit today when it comes to prioritizing and building diversity-centric recruiting and hiring strategies, right? Do you think the ball is moving in the workplace, or are there some struggles there still?
Well, I think there are certainly, so that's a great question. So first, I mean, let me provide some context. So as Liv mentioned, diversity is not a new buzzword, right? I mean, that's been part of the jargon of business speak since the 70s, right? And trying to make the workplace more inclusive. What we've really seen, though, that's changed over in the past 5 years, really starting with the Me Too movement and then going into, the broader push right now for racial justice and truly an honest conversation in this country about the role race plays in a lot of aspects of life, including privilege, is to look at our role with diversity in a company's role and not just saying, you know, you need to be a good person, follow the golden rule, and make colorblind decisions, to the recognition that throughout our society, including in businesses, because they're part of this society, there are systemic benefits that go to certain groups and that don't go to other groups. And if we really want to create a landscape that's equitable, we need to be honest and start addressing those. So I know we're going to focus on technology, but technology is a really great way to do that. There are other aspects too, but I think looking at, saying, what is the impact of saying when we do recruiting, we're only going to recruit from, these Ivy League schools in New England, and is that really going to get us the best workplace? What if we said, we're going to expand that to, historically Black colleges and universities, and we're going to start recruiting there as well. And we're also going to start recruiting at minority job fairs throughout the country. And not only that, we're looking at the enrollment of who goes to college in our industry, and it's overwhelming. It's not as diverse as the metropolitan area at large. What can we do, and how can we partner to build a broader pipeline? And so I guess what I'm saying is I think it's a long game that you need to play, because part of it is, making changes as a business so that your applicant pool is more diverse, which will lead your hiring pool to be more, or the folks you hire to be more diverse. But the other reality is we need to expand the diversity of that applicant pool, and that's something that takes more time. For a lot of industries, there is a lack of diverse applicants, and you can look around for a long time, but that's going to be a problem. And so you really need to be focusing, if you want to create change, you really need to be focused on how do we increase the pipeline also.
Yeah, absolutely. Your comment about the pipeline just remind me of, in our last HR at the Table webinar, we interviewed MarketCast's CHRO, Regina
Oh, cool.
Johnson. Yeah, and one of the questions from our audience was, how do you, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a priority in your company, but how do you get there when your current company doesn't look diverse from the outside in, right? How are you recruiting diverse talent when right now you just look like another company, right? It doesn't look like it's a value. It doesn't look like your employee, your workforce doesn't represent the applicant pool that you're trying to attract, right?
I think that's right. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a real issue. And I mean, I think you can see with, it's not enough. I don't know if it was ever enough, but I mean, it's certainly not enough from a recruiting perspective now to only make known your support for the gay community in June and the Black community in February and the Hispanic community right now during Hispanic Heritage Month. That's not enough. I mean, you need to be showing a deep commitment throughout the year, and that's really how and I think you need to be honest. I think when you're recruiting people, at least, I do a ton of interviewing as part of my job. And I would say it's a cornerstone of virtually every question I get when I'm interviewing people is, how is your company on issues of diversity and inclusion? What are you doing to move the needle? And I think a lot of it is to say, like, we don't give ourselves an A. No company that's honest anywhere in the United States should give themselves an A. Because if you give yourself an A on these efforts, you're not trying hard enough. because even if you're the best in whatever your industry is with diversity, you can move further and you can do better. And I think that hunger to improve, to change the layout, the makeup of who are the leaders is really important. I think ways you can start out by it, because I think there is something, and studies of unconscious bias show this, that if an applicant walks into a room for an interview and on their way to the interview, everyone they see is a different skin color than them, they're not going to perform as well, because it's sending a message to them that you're different, and it creates a heightened level of trepidation that they wouldn't otherwise have. So what are ways you can signal that you want to, address that elephant in the room and say you want to change it? Say, we're so excited to be interviewing you. This is our first year going to Howard University, the kind of one of the preeminent African American universities. We're so excited to grow and build a more diverse talent platform, and then I think also, as you and I have talked about a lot, is how do you sustain that once you bring people in the door? And what are your retention efforts in terms of mentoring and giving people priority? It's not, I think some people would talk about reverse discrimination. That's not really what this is at all. I would say it's emphatically not. What it is more is making sure that the type of natural mentorship relationships that often happen between colleagues, to make sure that that's also happening with your diverse hires, that they're getting the experiences that they need to move up the ladder, that they're being given those opportunities, that the playing field actually is level, and you're leaving a lot less to chance. So you're giving folks the ability to shine and really show that they're the best person for the job.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you mentioned the concept of a grade, right? Having an A. And I think it's important to emphasize that diversity, equity, and inclusion will never be complete, right? We'll never get that A like you mentioned. We as humans, us as a whole, as a society, as organizations and companies, there's always going to be more work to be done. And with that, I want to ask you, what do you see as one of the biggest opportunities for organizations to improve their DE&I effectiveness in talent management in the whole process, right? Is it through the hiring experience? Is it the recruiting experience? Is it the exit process, right? Exit strategy? Just be curious.
Yeah, so I think all of those steps are hugely important. And I think what's really exciting about the time we live in now is we have so much data that we can digest at our fingertips. So we have the ability to actually analyze where in the process, from someone's first day seeing an ad online to their last day leaving the company, where did we have our diversity successes and where are we falling short? And you can measure it. Now, the obvious downfall of that is once you start mining data and doing that analysis, you're creating a paper trail. If someone sues you, they can be like, hey, you are discriminating. Let's look at it. So I mean, obviously, if you're going to go down this road, you need to be serious about wanting to make changes and looking at the numbers and seeing where are we having problems? How can we do improvements? I think that in one way to do it is it's important to take a look at your job descriptions. How are you marketing this job? And what potential signals are you sending in that language? There's actually software out there that you can use to degender your job applications. And part of that is meaning, to replace him with, him or her, or just they, more gender neutral things, but can also be saying, taking a deeper look and saying, what is the real goal? Because if you want to say that we need someone who's been in a leadership position for 10 years to do this job, we're just by saying that, we're skewing our job applicant pool to be overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male. If you change it to take that out and instead talk about the skills that someone has as a leader of 10 years, like ability to juggle, you know, 7 different 7-figure projects at once, and to work collaboratively and productively with a team of 45 people, right? You're being more specific, but that's opening the doors because people say, oh yeah, I've had that. Maybe I wasn't promoted. Maybe my job title didn't reflect that that's what I was doing, but that's actually what I was doing. And that's a really high, I'm thinking of like a senior executive type position, but this works at every position level, where it's really important to think about what does success look like? And it's the way we're listing it in the job description. Is that just looking for a carbon copy of who we already have? Or more broadly, is it looking for the ideal person who would succeed in this role? And often those two things don't overlap. The way you've always done it is not the way you're going to get the best person for the job.
Yeah, wow. Really, really good stuff to unpack there, Sam. First of all, I think that example you gave of how you can be more specific without limiting your pool, right? You're actually becoming more inclusive just by the language of your job descriptions. I think that's relatively known, but that example alone was, to me, I was just like, whoa, didn't think about that, because I think we tend to think the more specific we get, the more we're limiting our applicant pool, and that's not necessarily the case. And I think it goes back to the intentionality of the work we do in HR and TA, even all the way down to the job descriptions, as you mentioned. We do have a question. Natalie Hawkins asked this question: what advice or guidance would you provide to an organization that is interested in launching ERGs, employee resource groups? Love to hear it.
I think they're fabulous. So, thanks, Natalie, for that question. So in ERG, there's different things that different companies call them. Some people call them affinity groups. I like the term ERG because it's really just saying on its face what it's here for. It's a resource for employees to use. It's a place where employees can find people who maybe have a similar background. Maybe it's race, maybe it's veteran status, maybe they're parents. I mean, you can have an ERG on any topic where you think it will help you connect with other people, and you can bond together about how have you faced this challenge or how have you done that. It can also be a great place to grow the business. An ERG, I'm actually, to pat myself on the back, I'm the head of my company's ERG for our LGBTQ plus affinity group. And I can tell you a big thing we talk about is not only, how do we welcome new people, both as folks who identify as LGBTQ, but also allies. How do we welcome them? How do we help to make sure they're having a successful time at work? But we also talk about how can we share with the rest of the world what a great company it is that I work for, and what are ways that we can show our community, get involved in the community through volunteerism and activism, but also what are ways that we can just tout it otherwise? What are the surveys that exist for, like you can think about like Working Mother as an example, or there's all these different studies that happen, and an ERG can be a really pivotal force in terms of building a business's brand with a certain group. The ERG can also be a really helpful sounding board as businesses are looking for ways to improve their retention efforts. What can we do to like you can have really honest conversations, and management can have those with the folks in the ERG. What are ways we can change our benefit offerings to be more inclusive? What are ways we can shift our part-time leave policy to be more welcoming to help mothers stay, or not mothers, but just parents stay at work after they become parents? And I think that's also looking at data. That's a way, the ERG can help mine, to a point, the exit interview data, and talk to people who've left the firm and say, or the company, and say, like, what led you to leave? What could we have done differently that would have helped you to stay? So I think the ERG is really a wonderful resource, and it in my view, it only has upside. The risk with an ERG is if you make it exclusive. You want to make sure that your ERGs are open to allies, and that you let people create their own ERGs.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that answer, Sam. Natalie, great question. Thanks for using that question functioning and submitting that. Now, Sam, I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the HR tech side, or HR tech element of DE&I. And I want to start off with actually a poll. So I'm going to launch this poll for our audience. This is a poll that we have been doing for throughout our HR at the Table series, and basically we're going to pull together a report at the end of this that will share the results of what tech solutions are being replaced or considered throughout this year for HR and talent acquisition professionals. And I think it's really helpful for our audience to also gauge where, and also just hear feedback of where their colleagues are at when it comes to HR tech. You've already mentioned it, Sam, it can be super helpful, right? We'll talk about some of the challenges later, but HR technology overall can be very beneficial, and I think that's especially true with your DE&I strategies as well. So I'll give our audience a few more seconds to respond, but Sam, let's start off. Where do you think technology fits into the mix of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think it's a tool. I think it's a really important tool. I don't think, I think it's important to not say our D&I strategy is using AI, okay? I think that shirks the responsibility that we all have as individuals to, make a value on, or, make diversity and inclusion more of a reality at our workplaces. I think what's really awesome about AI is it's a good fact check. I think if you ask someone, am I biased in my decision making? 100% of people will say no. And we know that's not true, right? So having objective data that you can look at and say, like, I know you don't want to be biased, right? But here's a learning lesson. Here's something we saw about how you viewed two very similar people differently, or how you responded differently in a similar situation. And it doesn't even have to be that pointed. I mean, you can just say, here's generally what we're seeing. Here's how we can do a better job. But so I think you want to use AI to empower people to change, and to more walk the walk when it comes to diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about technology. Not, it's not the end all be all, like you mentioned, but it's a helpful tool. I'm going to share these results for our audience. Sam, any surprises here? We have ATS, CRM, background screening, assessment. Any surprises on these results, or the tools that you think can make a big difference in an organization's talent strategy with that D&I lens on?
I guess it's interesting. I mean, looking at that no replacement button or the poll for that, I wonder if that reflects businesses that have already adopted technology, or businesses that are holdouts. In terms of it sounds about right to me that background screening would be the highest. I think that that's a really um, useful way, and it can be a really cost-effective way to uh, to maximize efficiency while lowering some costs. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I also think ATS, in my view, is really the way of the future. I just think it adds so much efficiency. So yeah, I mean, I think these track. I would just be interested in seeing a little more, kind of behind the numbers when it comes to the no replacement.
Right, yeah, yeah. And if audience, if you want to share maybe in the chat function or the question, I think Sam and I would both be curious on why no replacements, right? Do you already have your HR tech stack established, or are you not using technology quite yet, and you're still not at that point? That's a great observation, Sam. So I do want to get into how professionals, HR and TA, can use technology to assess diversity gaps. I think you briefly mentioned it, but I'd just like to dig in there a little bit more. Like, how can they use the technology solutions out there to assess diversity gaps in their current hiring strategy?
Yeah. So just focused on gaps. What you can do is you can really mine the data. So I mean, for an example, you could look at, and it depends on what metric you're focused on. So let's say you want to increase the number of, female applicants, or you want to increase, your ultimate goal is to increase the number of female senior managers, let's say. Okay, so you look at, you can look at data to say how many female managers do we have right now? What is the standard in the industry that we're in? What is the percentage? How do we fare? And then look at, how do we improve? So what would that look like? So, and it starts out looking at what is our applicant pool on a gendered basis. What percentage of our applicants are female? If it's lower than what we want, how do we increase the pool of applicants? How do we grow that size so it's more representative of society at large? And maybe it is doing the things we were talking about before, like changing the job description. Not actually changing the job, but changing how we talk about the job so that it's more inviting for new people or different types of people to apply. It's the same question when you get to hiring. What is it in hiring that is leading us to disproportionately reject the female applicants? Maybe there's certain buzzwords that our interviewers are looking for that the women don't seem to have. A lot of times people talk about, they didn't have like the level of gravitas, or they didn't carry themselves like a leader. And I think that's a really helpful way. If you see that the problem is on hiring, you're fine getting people in the door, but then they're not being hired. What does that say? And I think a lot of coaching and training is then helpful to help people perhaps uncover some biases they have, or let them know that, we're not looking for carbon copies of who we already have. Like, if you think the best senior manager is Bill, well, Bill's fabulous, but, to grow our company and get to the next level, we need someone who has all of these additional skills, because that's what the senior manager of tomorrow looks like. So I think through training and being really clear about what your goals are for hiring, that can have a big role. The same thing can happen when you're looking at, once someone is in the door, what does their promotion trajectory look like? And you can look at that. You can look at performance reviews. You can look at, salary increases, and you can assess what does this look like? Again, as I mentioned, that the risk with doing this is you're creating a lot of evidence that if you're ever sued, you will have to turn over. Okay? Which doesn't mean don't do it. It just means if you want to go down this road, work with lawyers to do it in a way that's legally sound and it's going to be minimizing risk, and be committed to taking action based on what you learn. It's also, numbers are numbers. They don't tell the whole story. So I do think with all of this, you need to be having a lot of face-to-face discussions with your team, getting team buy-in, and also getting feedback on what's really happening. The numbers can only tell part of the story, and that's always true.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about the challenges with using HR technology for DE&I initiatives. But I love that you mentioned, it doesn't mean don't do it, right? Doesn't mean we live in this safe box. Means for us to get better as organizations and as society, we just have to be intentional about it. I keep going back to that word because I think that's really true.
Yeah, and I think on that point, to the opposite of don't do it, to very strongly, seriously consider doing this, is that the status quo isn't really working, right? Just saying, we want to be nicer, we want to make our office more like Mr. Rogers on Sesame Street. That's not cutting it. Like, there are issues in every company that are making it harder for some people to succeed, and we need to be really honest about that. And we need to do our part. We all need to do our part to make things more equitable so that people really can be, viewed on their merit. Because however much we want that to be true, that's not the reality anywhere in this country.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Sam, just to continue, what ways can you see HR and TA professionals optimizing the technology available to them for their DE&I initiatives? You kind of mentioned the ATS when we had that poll, but just curious, like, is it social networking? Is it an HRIS system?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. There is, like, the world is your oyster right now. Like, honestly, like, do a Google search, you'll just be like, wow. Like, there's so much at like every stage of the process. So one is, your applicant pool. You can use technology, and there's services out there that will broaden your pool of applicants by how they through targeted means, right? And so they'll specifically look to how do we expand, the demographic reach of your post, especially in this world of COVID, where, before you all joined, me and Liv were just kind of talking about, like, where are people of verified first working from, and I know I can say the same for my office, but like, being in a specific metropolitan area is a lot less relevant. And so if you're looking for the top talent, you know, that can also, and you're looking outside your initial metropolitan area, that can be a really great opportunity to use AI to increase your applicant pool. You also can have AI do, um, review the resumes, so that there's a lot of biases that we all bring into resume screens based on, oh, I'm from Minneapolis. Oh, this person's from Minneapolis. Like, I want to talk to them. Well, like, selfishly, that's awesome for me. Like, good for me to like talk to people from Minneapolis, but that's not a good reason. Or Liv is from Washington, but like, that doesn't mean that's a good person to talk to. Like, someone shouldn't get extra bonus points because of that. And that's a really neutral reason, but it just shows how easy it is to fall into these things and what we give people points for. Or someone's hobby might be something that you're like, oh, I have that hobby, or I've always wanted to learn about that. But it's something that's totally irrelevant. And so software can be really helpful at looking at things in a very black and white neutral way. You can also use software. Studies show that if someone has an African American sounding name, they're 8 times less likely to get an interview. They can submit their applications, but they're 8 times less likely to actually get an interview than someone with an identical resume, but not a black sounding name. AI can be really helpful. It's just eliminating that bias. You can also use AI though at the interview. There are a lot of brands out there where they videotape interviews, And so you have a person conducting the interview, you have a person asking the question, but it's on tape. And they're looking at the responses to say, who responded the best? You know, who was the most engaging in their answer? I mean, kind of whatever you're setting your metrics at. Though there's software that looks through that to try to take out the kind of systemic inequity and trying to equalize it. I think part of it though, and I just, I know this is your next question, but I just have to say to jump the gun, like obviously there's a lot of risk with over relying on this technology, and that's why people need to be the ones, not machines, need to be the ones making decisions and looking at this data. All of these programs were written by people. These people bring their own biases to the table because we all do. I mean, I think you've seen that with a lot of facial recognition software, that it wasn't, when they're testing it out, they underrepresented groups in society generally are very underrepresented when it comes to those testing things. And so, they're not as great as recognizing facial expressions of those with African American skin types, right? Because that wasn't part of their computer modeling. So that's a bias. So you want to ask questions, right? If you're going to go this route, you need to make these companies show what their DE&I strategy was to make sure that they minimize bias. And you want to talk about bias, and you want to see what their views were. You also want to see when you get the results, does it shake out what they're saying? The brain of a computer is awesome. Think about like 2001, but so are our brains. So let's look at this and evaluate it and say, are we happy with this? Do we think what this software is saying is accurate and that these are truly the best candidates? And if not, why? And how can you talk to your vendor about modifying things so it's more on point going forward? But you want it to be, a discussion, and not just that you buy this off-the-shelf product and then, great, that's our D&I initiative for the year, we're done now. Like, it's not that workable. It's not that easy. Like it's one tool of many, with our brains being a very important tool.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And in our last HR at the table, we kind of talked about that as well. You have to ask the right questions when selecting your technology solutions. Just like you're asking on your ATS and your CRM, ask intentional questions and have that D&I lens on, right? So you're thinking, is this gonna cause more harm than good, right?
And I would also say, make sure you speak to someone who can speak plainly, because it's really easy to be intimidated by someone who gives a very technical, techie answer, and don't accept that. Like you're spending money to buy a product. You deserve the ability to understand in plain language what it is you're buying and what are the answers to these very valid questions. And have confidence in asking that you're certainly not the first person and definitely are not the last who's going to be pushing them on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And with that, as our audience builds out their HR tech stack or reevaluates maybe their current tech stack, we talked about technology as a means to an end, right? It's not the end all be all. There's got to be people behind it. There's got to be heart behind it and commitment behind it. But let's talk about some of the red flags or implications that you see when HR teams or talent acquisition teams are using just depending on technology for D&I initiatives. What are some of those legal concerns?
Well, I think that some of them we've talked about so far, which is that there can be built-in bias in this software, and so even though you're well-intentioned, the impact of it is harmful, and it's not meeting your goals, and that certainly could may create legal risk. Well, certainly though, it's going against your business objective. If your business objective is to create a more equitable, more diverse workplace, and you're relying on software that doesn't cut it, then you're moving further from that goal, and you're definitely not moving closer. So I think that's a primary risk. I also think another issue is it can allow people to shirk their responsibility. And it's really important to remember that even if you have the perfect technology system in terms of getting the most diverse talent pool and the best talent pool in the door, their success on a day-to-day basis is based on their interaction with their colleagues, the support they receive, the mentoring they receive. Those aren't things that a computer can ever offer. And so you need to make sure that as a workforce, you are making it a priority to make sure that everyone succeeds and reaches their highest potential. And, anything we can do. And I think as HR, we have wonderful tools. And I think there is a real business desire in a way that, I don't think there's ever been before to really try to make movement on this. I think that the reckoning we've seen in the past year, I think people are waiting for a blowback. It really hasn't happened. I think that the business forces in this country are very strongly aligned on the issues of DE&I and making sure that their workplaces are reflective of our very diverse society.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And Sam, before we move on to talking about long-term change, we do have a question from Gary. He mentions with video interviews, it still relies on how the responses are interpreted by a human. Isn't there a potential for bias there? How could AI assist with that?
Yeah, so no, there actually is. There are AI services that are reviewing the video, and they can review it for all sorts of things. Like they can review it for, is this person being honest in their response? And they can do things like that. Which ways are their eyes moving when they answer, and that can be telling about if someone's being honest in their response. They can also, so yeah, I mean, it's not just left to people, these services, and that's why it has a lot of great potential, because it can take out whatever commonality there is between the interviewer and the interviewee that might build a rapport, and saying, just like on an objective basis, this person was most truthful, this person was most confident, whatever your factors are. I mean, obviously we want everyone to be confident, to be truthful. We want everyone to be truthful, whether or not, it depends on what the job is. Is it going to be a forward-facing thing where you want to see, how expressive is someone? What is the, versus, you can have all different things, and the AI can analyze it. But you as people need to then assess it and be like, is this really ready for prime time? Like, how well does the software, we know what it's promised to do, but how well does it actually work? And are we comfortable that what it's saying is accurate? And that's why, doing a test drive is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Gary. And I think Sam kind of already reiterated it, but humans aren't perfect, technology is not perfect. So
nothing's perfect.
Yeah, nothing's perfect, right? Awesome. Well, Sam, I want to, we're about 10 minutes out, so I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about facilitating long-term change in organizations, right? We're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and using it for recruiting and hiring, but they're not just agenda items that we can check off, right? We've talked about that. They're deeply important initiatives that require so much more. So I'd love to talk about, what the role is in technology in retaining diverse talent, right? So you've got them, you have diverse talent applying, you're hiring them, that's great. What about retention? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think that HR technology certainly plays a role. I think, you had mentioned before HRIS and using an HRIS platform. I think that's really critical towards retention. And that's because when you're creating ERGs, which I also think is a critical part of retention, the self-identification on an HRIS system, it can really transmit the values of the company. By asking for information on race or sexual orientation or gender identity or veteran status, you're flagging your workforce. It's important for us that we have diversity. We wouldn't ask these questions unless we wanted a diverse range of responses. We're not going to ask about veteran status if we didn't make it a priority to hire veterans. We're not going to ask about gender identity if we weren't trying to increase the number of non-cisgender employees that we have, right? So I think you send a message by doing that. I also think you then create a community where people know about each other, and can reach out and connect. And that's hugely important for someone feeling at home and in the workplace so that they'll want to stay. So I think those are really important things. You also, though, by asking those questions, you can start to say, how are we doing on this metric right now? And then start measuring to see in a year, how have we improved? If we hired the most diverse class of people ever in 2019, how many of them are still here in 2020? Okay, you can use data to really look at that, and you can use just your HRIS system to analyze it. What computers can't do is tell you, well, why did they leave, right? So you want to talk to people, and you want to use your exit interviews, and you want to reach out to people who've left and say, we were really sad that you left. We understand that happens. Let's talk a little more about it, and do it a month or two after they've left, so they don't feel the pressure of, you get, as all of you know, what someone says in an exit interview might not be the whole story of what happened, and sometimes people need time to process and even need another job to see how things were different or not different. But I think that a baseline is using your HRIS system to map where you are and to just see on a base level where you're going. And then if you want to detail further, you can look at in what groups or departments are certain diverse employees faring better, where they seem to move up the chain, and other departments, why does there seem like people are getting stuck or leaving? And and then analyze, what can we do to change that, or why is that? I think the tech can be really helpful to show you the what, and then you need people to be able to look into, well, why is this happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit on something just perfectly, talking about the community and the transparency of, hey, this is why we ask these questions. We're trying to do better as an organization. And in a previous HR at the Table webinar, we talked about how D&I is something everyone in the organization has to breathe and live, right? It's got to be this commitment. And sometimes it's easier, in some organizations than others. It can depend on cultures and values. But I think that you reiterated that, right? That commitment. That is just that's so.
I would also say that reaching out to former employees, it can create a lot of goodwill. That you're trying to say, like, we want to be a better corporate citizen. In your view, how could we do things better? You're not saying you did anything wrong. You're not admitting whatever. I mean, that's not really the point of it. It's more just to say, like, we were sad that you left after 8 months. Why do you think that was? What could we have done differently to have a different story here? And maybe nothing, but maybe there might be some really useful nuggets that you can use in thinking about how to build, a better process going forward for retention.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Sam, in your experience, I just want to build on that a little bit. We've had questions on getting leadership on board with long-term change, right? Sometimes it can be a short-term commitment or a budget approval for a new solution maybe, but generating that long-term change. Do you have any, from your experience, any techniques or strategies behind getting leadership on board and then getting your whole organization on board with D&I strategies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, every company is different, and so it's hard to speak in um, generalities. Like I would say, a lot of companies I work with are in Minnesota, and whatever their view of leadership was, being at the epicenter of, right where George Floyd was murdered, that
Mm,
created geographic shockwaves. And I know it created shockwaves all over the country, but specific to Minneapolis, if you were an employer in Minneapolis, you were going to respond.
right.
And I think that's just true. I think that historically, it's been, I think strategies that work are making the business case. And I think there's a lot of ways you can make a business case for diversity. You can talk about, brand loyalty and how that improves when you start reaching out to diverse communities and what the real spending power of those communities is. You can talk, and it's not just talk. I mean, it's objective data, about, and it's easy to find, and it's a lot of it's free. So it's not hard. It's just doing the work to say
Yeah.
like companies that create these inclusive policies. Here's what happens. Here are examples of how they benefit. And I think it's telling that story. I also think it's saying like, look, I know I'm not alone in feeling like we could do a better job here. And you know,
Mm,
think about the corporate culture and how it could be improved if we started to take some steps and make clear to folks that we wanted to do a better job on these issues. So I think it's knowing the personalities of your leaders, um, and then thinking about what is going to be most persuasive to them to have these discussions.
yeah, absolutely. I think that vulnerability of saying this is where we are at the moment and we can do better, I think that's huge, right?
Yeah.
um, that with the business case for leadership. Well, Sam, we're kind of approaching our time, so I want to ask you any last remarks, anything else you want to share with our audience as key takeaways.
I just want to say I think this is a really exciting time. And there's no one has a crystal ball to know what the future is, but I would just encourage you as companies to be willing to fail forward and try new things to see what works, what doesn't, as you're trying to move forward. But I think this process of trying to have a more representative workplace and realize that that will make your business more successful, your employees happier, and you'll be able to deliver a better product is really an exciting goal. So I just want to commend you all for working towards that.
Yeah, I love that fail forward and disrupt the status quo a bit. Sam, it has been such a pleasure having you today. Thank you for having me interview you and just all of your insight. I'm pretty sure our audience gained something. I sure did, buckets full. I wish I could have been taking notes, but maybe I'll watch the recording after. So, but Sam, thank you again. I also want to give another thank you to our sponsors of this episode of HR at the Table, Smart Recruiters and Zoho Recruit. Thank you both. And with that, I'm going to leave it back up to the voice in the wind on how you can get Sherman HRCI credit for today.
Thanks, Liv. Well, that about wraps up our discussion today. I want to thank everyone for your attendance, as it is always important to leverage the tools we have available to improve your hiring strategy and overall workplace culture. I'd also like to give a big thank you to our host, Liv Carter, and to Sam for having this great and relevant discussion. Liv, like you were saying, I hope our audience gained something from this because I have learned a tremendous amount, and this conversation has been so valuable. We would love to hear what you thought about our webinar today, so make sure to leave us some feedback on our post-webinar survey. For our live attendees, stick around just a little bit longer for that post-webinar survey to redeem one SHRM and/or HRCI credit. For any of our on-demand listeners, check your email for instructions on how to redeem that credit. We'll be sending out the webinar on demand in case you want to use this for reference or send it to a colleague. Please, 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 please take me up on that last one on sending it to colleague, because this was such an amazing discussion that we had, and it is always so important to keep DE&I at the forefront of our decision making. Also, stay tuned for more HR at the Table webinars and for blogs deep diving into today's topic. Next, we are interviewing Debbie Rosenberg, Vice President of HR at Chesapeake Regional Medical Center, to define agility for HR and TA professionals in the midst of a war for talent. We hope you can make it, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.